You can have a long and successful career building reporting services reports without ever being aware of RDL or how it's structured. Nevertheless, it can be helpful to at least be aware of RDL and have an overall idea of how it's structured. Sometimes looking at the RDL for a report you've created using a tool can yield valuable insights into how reporting services works to create final rendered reports. And occasionally, it can be useful to directly tweak the code. And if you want to build your own tool to generate RDL, you'll need to be intimately familiar with its structure and how it works. The report definition file, and therefore the RDL within it, describes a report, including information about the data used in the report layout, and various properties of the report. The RDL is a declarative model that describes the desired outcome, the final report rendered with all its data, but not the steps needed to accomplish that outcome. It's up to the other features of reporting services to determine and execute those steps. I'm going to use this RDL file that I created previously. This describes the customer contact list report for customer data in the AdventureWorks LT 2012 database. Visual Studio and SQL Server data tools provide a nice graphical designer for building reports. But you can also use the code editing features to view the RDL and edit the code. Alright, so if you look at Solution Explorer here, you'll see there's the customer contact list.rdl file that I created. If I just double click on this, that just opens up the designer once again. But I can also right click on it and select View Code, and that opens up an XML text editor window that displays the underlying report definition language code. Okay, so as you can see, this is just plain old XML. The nice thing about viewing this within the Visual Studio XML editor is that you have the benefit of color coding of elements, attributes, and contents, as well as the editing features that Visual Studio provides. The report designer, all it's really doing is putting a pretty face on this raw RDL code. Alright, so if you explore the RDL for a typical report file, you'll find that there are a few key elements. This report element here contains all other elements and defines the namespaces used by the RDL, both for the report definition as well as an RD namespace with information used exclusively by the report designer and that's not actually part of the report definition itself. That is things like locations of elements on the designer and so forth. Okay, then there are three child elements of report. One is body, width, and page. These three elements contain most of the report definition. Body contains the definition of the report items as well as the height of the report body. Width defines the report width, and page contains margin and style information. So you can see the contents of page there. There's width, so the width of the report is 5 inches. As you can see, the default report is narrower than it needs to be for even a printed page, so you have control over that. And then if I re-expand the body section here, you can see that there's various text boxes and various other elements. The tablets actually displays the data, and a lot of fairly complex layout information. Okay, so those are the first three elements. The next important element is the data sources element. And this contains one or more data source elements. As you can see here, this particular report, again a simple report, contains a single data source because it pulled information from a single location, from a specific table within the AdventureWorks database. So what this is doing is it's defining where the data is going to come from for the report. And so as you expect, that contains the connection string information right there. Also indicates that I used integrated security, and there'd be different values there if I needed to provide a username and password. And it also defines a unique data source ID. Now, if you define a shared data source for the report, that's a data source that can be shared amongst multiple reports. Then the data source element will simply reference the named source. Or if you define a report data source, as that's what I did for this particular report here, the data source element contains the connection string. So you'll have different kinds of information based on the type of data source that you're using. Okay, the next up is data sets. This item contains one or more data set elements. So you can see I have one named dataset1 right there. This defines the data to be retrieved from one or more data sources for the report. Usually this element is going to define a query, as well as the field names and data types returned by the result set. If the query includes parameters, which you easily can do for a report, the dataset element will also contain a query parameters element that contains the name and value for each of the query parameters. I didn't use any parameters for this very simple report, so that element doesn't exist. All right, so there's the query. There's my select star from saleslt.customer, and then there are the list of the fields with the data types of each of the elements. Okay, then depending on the report design, the RDL can also include various other elements. Probably the most complex part of the RDL, though, is going to be the report items element, which is a child of the body element, because it contains the definition of data regions within a report. The more complex the report, the more complex that element is going to be.